One of the tragedies of life is that men motivate things. James Bond is a motivator. He goes to point A, and he knows why he's going to point A. And if he meets a girl on the way, you know, it is to be used for the situation, his mission. It's very difficult to write a good Bond lady's part. It really is very difficult because they're there as part of the scenery.
James Bond first appeared on the bookstands in 1953.
Well, why do you think a hero has become so popular with the reading public?
His task is a straightforward one, and he goes for it in a fairly straightforward fashion. And I think people like the action.
James Bond blossomed into something incredible that perhaps Ian Fleming may not have realized it would become when he was writing them.
It's very old-fashioned. It's something that's gone through the generations.
If you don't give your man 007, I will.
If your man lives for excitement, give him 007. There's a 007 gift set for every assignment.
I think a lot of people just want the escape and the entertainment value of it.
He became a product of his time, and once I started to understand that, I was able to look at all the Bonds in a different light.
I see those women from the earlier films as very much stereotyped as a traditional archetype of what an ideal woman supposedly is supposed to be.
So in terms of even the era that we're looking at, the 50s and the 60s, so we do have the swinging 60s, sexual freedom. We also have the Playboy era. We have this connection between James Bond and Playboy, where Ian Fleming, some of his short stories were presented in Playboy.
A bunny is an American creation. She's a cross between a hostess showgirl and a barmaid waitress, well versed in the art of charming the cash customers in a string of plush international clubs. Oh yes, view her as you will, a bunny can be most appealing, which for charity work is just the right tack.
She's a kind of idealized, not available girl, not the girl next door, but she is something which is in Walter Mitty's dream world, really.
Well, again, I would beg to differ to some extent, because she is, without question, purposely an idealization. At the same time, recognizing that the Playmate and the other pictures in the magazine are only pictures in the magazine. They're not human beings and can't be equated with human beings. They are only paper and ink.
The Bond films not only react to what is happening in popular culture, but also kind of feed into it and offer one particular interpretation of it.
Here she is. She is single and fun-loving.
We had to have kind of these ideal women.
You know, the women of the 1960s, because the way that the novels are adapted, there's a little bit more flexibility and fluidity with the archetype of the Bond girl.
There's sort of the sacrificial lamb character. There's the female villain character, and there's the main Bond girl character who winds up surviving throughout the film.
At first they used to try to catch me, but they couldn't. Now I don't think they bother anymore.
Well, they will this time.
I really didn't know what they expect me to be, because they made such a big fuss, and I was scared I wouldn't be able to deliver or to come up to their expectation of me.
What's your name?
Ryder.
Ryder what?
Honey Ryder. What's so funny about it?
Nothing. It's a very pretty name.
People think, oh, well, that's what I represent to the producer or to the director or to the part in the film. They think, oh, well, she's right for that because they see me in that way.
You're going to have a Bond girl that is going to be always a damsel in distress.
Of course, this is James Bond's universe, so he gets the glory and he gets to move on. Women who lived in the 60s and the 70s understood the progression. They were living it. They knew what came before, and they knew what lied ahead in terms of achievements and what opportunities were now open to them.
I mean, isn't it about time women's lib moved in and James Bond
yes,
became...
I think that it's high time that James Bond met women's lib, and don't think we haven't been playing around in that area.
Oh, good, so it might be on the cover.
Feminism is enabling and empowering a woman to make a choice of how she wants to live her life. And if she wants to assume a certain role, then she should have that opportunity to do it.
The drama and all the excitements surrounds a woman, whether it's sexual or business or whatever. You know, that women were absolutely central.
My dear uncooperative Domino.
How do you know that? How do you know my friends call me Domino?
It's on the bracelet on your ankle.
I would say that the women in the 1960s sort of fit a binary or a dichotomy. There's the good woman and the bad woman.
I shall kill him.
Who has a liberal sexual identity, who kind of gets taken down a leg in her competition with Bond.
You should be locked up in a cage. What I did this evening was for king and country. You don't think it gave me any pleasure, do you?
But of course, I forgot your ego, Mr. Bond. James Bond, who only has to make love to a woman and she starts to hear heavenly choir singing. She repents and immediately returns to the side of right and virtue. But not this one.
That's a different type of representation than by the time we get into the 70s, we're seeing the backlash towards feminist gains.
I'm Babby.
And I'm Thumper.
They present a completely different version of what feminism and what femininity may be or should be. Bond essentially drowns them out, drowns out the women's liberation movement and what they represent.
Female villains, by comparison, tend to have these strong sexual identities, but what makes them dangerous is that they don't conform to Bond's. There's one interesting figure that comes in A View to a Kill, and that's Mayday.
I see you're a woman of very few words.
What's there to say?
She is an enigma in the franchise. I love her because she is the first black woman in a major role in a Bond film. And then Bond doesn't really know what to do with her because she is strong and she's a mixture of masculinity and femininity.
And retain your balance.
But how?
Get on the rig. I'll lower you down.
She starts off as villainous, but she sacrifices herself for Bond and the greater good.
She was one of the very few that she gave up everything.
Anytime a character can tell you about their inner life and their motivations, it humanizes her. Then we shift into the 90s and we see the influence of post-feminism coming into the Bond films. They play a lot on this notion that women can be sexual, but they can't be judged for their sexuality. And so you see Bond not only sexually interacting with women, but women using their sexuality for their own gain, and that's what the female villains do.
Those little subtleties demonstrate that the franchise has moved in such a way to represent women in a much better light than in the 1960s and early 1970s.
I would stress that we draw into question the assumption of progress, that just because time passes, that female representation will get better.
So they were smart enough to keep up with the times. You know, they didn't get left behind to become antiquated.
If you look at somebody like Jinx, her representation is different than white Bond girls. She's presented as being hypersexualized.
So what do predators do when the sun goes down?
Her first encounter with Bond, yes, it is a sex scene, because typically he waits and has to seduce them, and that's fine. But that scene is probably the most steamiest, most graphic sex scene that we have. There's sweat everywhere. They're sort of kind of moving around on each other. And that level of sexuality, that sort of animalistic sexuality, is not represented through white women. And so then the question is, why is that being represented through Halle Berry?
What it does is it makes Hollywood take a look at you differently.
Right.
You know, and as women of color, we don't often get parts to have them look at us differently.
Right.
You know, so many people have said to me, so do you think the reason that there's no African Americans nominated for Oscars every year is because there's something wrong with the Academy? And I said, no. Our work never gets seen by the Academy voters.
Right.
You know, we don't have great parts that they would respond to and think of Oscar. So that's the problem.
Are we tapping into the stereotypes and the tropes for black women in their representation? Does that recall then someone like Mayday and her representation as having an animalistic sexuality as well? You look at someone like Michelle Yeoh in Tomorrow Never Dies.
If I didn't know better, I'd say you were following me around, Mr. Bond.
What I find interesting about that film is she's only there for about half the film. It's as if having Michelle Yeoh for a much longer period in the film maybe would have taken our attention away that it was a Bond film and not Michelle Yeoh's Wei Lin film.
Don't get any ideas, Mr. Bond. Thanks for washing my hair. I work alone.
She brought in her own stunt team, that she is dynamic on screen, whereas Pierce Brosnan's Bond simply just punches a guy. I like these representations. They're different. They're breaking sort of the Bond girl mold, and it would be great to see greater diversity and to have these women not be stereotyped.
Just with what she brought to the table, a lot of strength, and I think that that's something that I can really I relate to, because as a woman who's looking to find strength and find independence and being able to make that connection, she's one of those people that I feel strongly about.
We do see a strengthening of women in heroic roles. I consider them to be action hero Bond girls. They really are truly co-heroes. I can want to have a female hero who can hold her own. Maybe it might not be, not everybody, like even our concept of heroism, you don't always have to be engaged in action to be heroic.
I've never seen you after hours, Moneypenny. Lovely.
Thank you, James.
Out on some kind of professional assignment, dressing to kill?
I know you'll find this crushing, 007, but I don't sit at home every night praying for some international incident so I can run down here all dressed up to impress James Bond. I was on a date, if you must know, with a gentleman. We went to the theatre together.
Moneypenny, I'm devastated. What would I ever do without you?
As far as I can remember, James, you've never had me.
James Bond could not be successful in his mission without her.
Hope springs eternal.
You know, this sort of behavior could qualify as sexual harassment.
She helps Bond become grounded.
Someday you have to make good on your innuendos.
After you, Moneypenny.
No, I insist. You first.
When we got the reboot with Naomi Harris, we actually got a nice backstory of Moneypenny that we didn't have before.
I've been reassigned. Temporary suspension from field work.
Really?
Something to do with killing 007.
Well, you gave it your best shot.
It was hardly my best shot.
Not sure I can survive your best.
It isn't kind of a head scratcher like, well, why is she not behind the desk anymore? Why is she out in the field? Why is she interacting with that action? Because she was trained to do that.
Take the shot. I said take the shot. I can't. I may hit Bond. Take the bloody shot.
It also leaves the door open where, because of their skill sets and because of their occupations and their intelligence and their ingenuity, their motivations and so forth, they're able to bring more to the table. And I think that as women, we have an opportunity to identify more with them than we have in the past.
I'm the money.
Every penny of it.
She doesn't have an action-oriented role, but she again is one who is very strongly developed.
I can't do that, James.
Look, I made a mistake. I was impatient. Maybe I was arrogant, but I could beat him.
Sorry.
Sorry? Sorry? Why don't you try putting that in a sentence, like maybe, sorry Lashif's gonna win, continue funding terror and killing innocent people. That kind of sorry?
You lost because of your ego, and that same ego can't take it. That's what this is about. All you're going to do now is lose more.
Well, then you're an idiot.
I'm sorry?
I said you're a bloody idiot.
Her experience is oftentimes the experience of women in high-level positions where there is an open questioning, because the way that we've viewed power historically has been through masculinity and through men, and specifically in our filmic representations in Western culture through white men.
You know, when you have a stronger female, you can have a stronger, more flawed James Bond. And I think that that makes the journey more interesting.
You think of women as disposable pleasures rather than meaningful pursuits. So as charming as you are, Mr. Bond, I will be keeping my eye on our government's money and off your perfectly formed house.
You noticed?
I think that there was a lot wrapped up in his persona as that hero, that he had to not have a vulnerability.
I want the truth.
James, you're hurting
I'll do worse than that if you don't tell me. You're doing this under orders, I know. What are they?
Who was that man in your room?
You're hurting me.
I thought that was the idea tonight. Now, who was he?
I don't know what you're talking about.
Oh, you're hurting my arm.
I'll break it unless you tell me where those bullets go.
What do the men think about James Bond? Because we talk a lot about women, and it's important, and it's an important dialogue. Just as important is what is the female gaze towards the man? What does the man think of James Bond? How does he measure himself? How does he perceive himself? There's an unrealistic expectation if men look to Bond to be that ideal. I could say that the male identity is still in a crisis.
And he will also, that man that's strong enough to be gentle, I think, really welcomes his liberation and the end of his loneliness and the end of this sea of hostility that has been, preventing love in this country, and that has been dehumanizing sex and making such loneliness and such alienation, frustration for everyone. And he will welcome a woman who can come out from behind that simpering, mask of ruffles that hides so much rage.
So it's fascinating. And James Bond is a great lens, especially for a male audience.
And who is your favorite Bond?
My favorite Bond is Daniel Craig because he's the coolest and more tougher than all the other Bonds.
He's pretty cool. I like Daniel Craig too. Yeah.
I think young men are able to look at these movies a little bit more maturely. That is the education of where we are now.
I don't want to see men get left behind and feel that they're in a crisis and that they don't have, role models that they can identify with.
Most scholarship looks at James Bond as a character, and everything sort of flows through him, but his world is populated by women. He's surrounded by women, and these women help us to understand him as a character. And I really wanted to focus in on them and their diversity.
I suspect that Bond was the first franchise really to make the women at least half the story.
I think we've opened up the Bond woman a whole lot more than the Bond male.
My agent got a call saying, would you be interested in doing a Bond? The story will be, there'll be a woman villain, there'll be a woman hero and all this kind of stuff.
Electra King, you get this very complex figure.
I could have given you the world.
The world is not enough.
She possesses all of the attributes, at least you think, of the typical Bond girl, and yet she's the primary villain.
8 million people need not die.
You should have killed me when you had the chance. But you couldn't. Not me. Not a woman you've loved.
She's the one who is in charge of all of the men.
No. I want them to see I'm not frightened. There's no point in living if you can't feel alive.
I think if you look at the Bonds, you know, they all bring something. Some are just gorgeous girls and whatever, and others, you know, are more complicated.
They have their own motivations, they have their own agendas, and I think that that's what makes them interesting.
All Bond women have pretty much been disregarded, that there's nothing of value that these women are bringing to the screen. I disagree, and I think based on the popularity of the franchise, we need to look to see if there is value instead of just assuming from the outset that it's not there.
Would you care for a drink?
Thank you. Your predecessor kept some cognac in the top.
I prefer bourbon. Ice?
The casting of Judi Dench as M was a reflection of that, by having a woman be the head of MI6.
You don't like me, Bond. You don't like my methods. You think I'm an accountant. A bean counter, more interested in my numbers than your instincts.
The thought had occurred to me.
Good. Because I think you're a sexist, misogynist dinosaur. A relic of the Cold War. Whose boyish charms, though wasted on me, obviously appeal to that young woman I sent out to evaluate you.
Point taken.
Not quite, 007. If you think for one moment I don't have the balls to send a man out to die, your instincts are dead wrong.
We can be who we want to be, not who we're told to be. Like, that's my image of feminism. That's not what everybody's image of feminism is, but I think there's many different articulations of it.
It really shows the extent to which she was a consummate professional throughout.
Those are very strong, independent women. They have their own motivations. They have their own agendas. And I think that that's what makes them interesting. I think it also allows Bond to be weak and allows them to have an opportunity to save him.
Did you ever ask yourself why you weren't killed that night? Isn't it obvious? She made a deal to spare your life in exchange for the money. I'm sure she hoped they would let her live.
What direction are we actually going to go in with these films? It's not just about casting Daniel Craig, but what do we do with him now?
So I think it would be very interesting to see how the whole James Bond framework and the James Bond formula could be applied or extended in different avenues.
I still think that Bond movies have a positive influence on the world.
We can't look at a Bond film and say, it's this, and just say, no, I'm not going to look at it anymore, because, or label it so simply as being this or this.
I don't have to buy into every single aspect of what I see on screen. That means it's the way that we read.
You have to look at them as a cultural phenomenon and analyze how things have influenced the James Bond films and how the films have influenced society. I don't think that you would see a lot of these action movies today if you did not have the James Bond films. I don't think that you would have an Ocean's 8 type film if you didn't have the Bond girl and the Bond girl character. You may not necessarily have all the female superhero movies as well without the Bond girl role.
As women, we have an opportunity to identify more with them than we have in the past.
It doesn't have to be this this binary that we have in society, that it has to be one thing or another. It's black or it's white, it's Democrat or it's Republican, it's this or it's that. Most of the images in a black and white photo are shades of gray, and most people fall somewhere in between when we actually look at how people think, feel, and identify.
So it is politically charged, it is socially charged. So we have to be able to mediate those things as well. The franchise is for everyone. The focus is a demographic that's men and women. So let's talk about it.
I think the films are going to keep a lot of elements of that formula and just apply them in modern contexts.
It's nice to look back, but I think that it's even better to look forward.
I think my biggest sort of push here is that we need more women on all film projects at every single level, from script writing to direction to cinematography. We need to have more women around and on set giving their input.
These movies would not fly without these Bond women.